Hello and welcome to GI Sprint, our new editorial event series all about making video games cheaper, faster and better. Over the coming weeks you'll read, listen and watch sessions on things like AI, cloud, team synergy, hybrid working, distributed development and a whole lot more. But to kick this series off, we've got a special guest who has been discussing this very issue, the sustainability of the games business, for at least 5 years now. He's currently a strategic advisor for a whole host of games companies, including Tencent, but he's probably best known for his years as the president and CEO of PlayStation America and the chairman of PlayStation Studios. It's Shawn Layden. Hi, Shawn. How you doing?
Hey, Chris. Pretty good, brother. How are you?
I'm delighted to have you here. I have to say, I always love talking to you. It's always absolutely fascinating because actually I was looking back and I was trying to see when the last time you hit the headlines when you were talking about games versus sustainability, and before the first time you did anyway. And the one I came up was in 2020, which is around The Last of Us Part 2 thing, which is 4 years ago. And at the time you were a bit concerned about particularly the move into the next generation and all the costs that might bring with it. And now we're almost 4 years into that generation, which is terrifying to me. But has it played out as you feared?
Sadly, it does my heart no good to say I think I was right, but it looks like I was, and it wasn't any great prediction. You're just watching trend lines over 25 years of gaming. You know, the numbers only go in one direction. Games don't get cheaper; they don't get shorter. They get more complex. They become more costly. Again, as we talked before, Chris, you know, the only factor that comes into the cost of the game is labor over time.
Yeah.
And you know, you're not building any factories. You're not turning sand into glass or something. It's just people power and what it costs to get the people together to make the game. And how do you manage those inputs into that formula that try to keep it below $250 million if you can. Yeah. And but frankly, you know, the large blockbusters, when people are swinging for the fences, they're coming in, you know, the 150, 200, $250 million bracket, and that is a huge burden on the game development business model, on the publishers for carrying that, and then I think we see some of the contraction in the marketplace in the game industry space that we've seen over the last 6 to 8 months. 2023 was just a horror show. Ask anybody in the business. When the price of money went up, the amount of money flushing through the systems went down. Consolidation was happening left and right, so much more industry energy seemed to go into buying a thing rather than building a thing. And now here we are in 2024, where quite frankly, earlier in the year, I don't know how to say this, Chris, I was actually more bullish on gaming in January than perhaps I am today in May.
Really? Oh, I've gone the other way.
Okay, good. I was me out of my blues.
I was in despair. Well, it's because I write the news, right? So I was in despair in January, and every story was miserable. There was no positives I could find anywhere. And then sort of when GDC started to kick off, there was still a lot of misery, but there was also a lot of new studios starting up, new funds forming. There was some stories amongst all that I wasn't getting 3 months earlier. So I started becoming a little more optimistic. Also, it helped that the first 3 months of the year also saw things like Power World and Helldivers break through, and the market sales of the industry wasn't as bleak as some analysts had predicted, at least for the first quarter. So that sort of gave me feel a little bit more optimistic, and I want to stress.
Well, how about the last 7 days, Chris?
Yeah, well, and that's. But then you're right. You know, there is all of this scenario where you know you've got what's going on at Take-Two and now Microsoft and but that stuff I did think particularly when I saw Microsoft's financials I was you could see outside of Activision Blizzard there's no growth there, which is the big problem, isn't it? Because you alluded it to their cost of money and stuff, but we saw wages and everything go up during the pandemic when the industry was booming and everyone was competing for talent, and then the cost of living crisis caused the wages to go up again. So you almost you have that on top of the cost of developing games for these new systems, and then you've got the fact that post pandemic the growth hasn't been there either. That's quite a I can understand now why you were feeling a little bit more bleak in May than you were a few months ago.
Let's not say bleak. Let's just say bearish,
yeah.
Rather than bullish. A bit bearish right now. I think the industry is still trying to right right the boat right now. And it's, to your point, right, growth has slowed down, costs have gone up. That's always a bad 1-2 punch. And I'm afraid the other thing which is in decline is patience. That's the real frustrating thing when you see people, look, here's a small studio. It made a great game. It has true promise. It created an entirely new, gaming experience. But we don't have the patience to play this thing out into part 2 or part 3. Even though we didn't really get wiped out by it, we didn't have the windfall profits that we thought we'd have, and so we just kill these things and go for more established AAA IP, sequels, copycats, and things that, from a financial perspective, you can draw a through line and say, if we build this game, it likely will perform like this in the market. When you bring in completely new things that people have not seen before, which may be fantastic and quite often are, the publishing industry doesn't have patience now to nurture these things, and they feel they need the quick big win, and that's a terrible place to be in an entertainment and creative industry.
That is actually I did by the time this has come out, it will be quite an old article now, but I've just published a piece where I talked about how it's related to the recent layoffs at Microsoft, where I was my concern was, at the beginning it was all about expanding the audience and finding new players and doing new things with new business models and new games, and my fear was that because of the situation, it's now about the big brands and the big blockbusters and focusing more on those, which you get, but I wrote in the piece, I said I hope that they've not given up on that dream either, because that's our future.
And hitting the blockbusters is not innovation, right? That's taking care of your bottom line, and that doesn't grow the market, because despite the fact that we can tell statistics that 75% of human beings are gamers, that includes everything from Words with Friends to Minesweeper to anything else you play on a tablet or a screen. But the console game business is still, we've talked about this before, 250 million units plus minus. Yeah. And all the growth we saw during the pandemic, or the majority of the growth we saw during the pandemic, was just getting more money from the same people. Yeah. Gamers were stepping up and putting more into their gaming obsession, and that made the business go up. We weren't really seeing an influx of new gamers. Certainly not in the console space.
I thought it's interesting, because I did wonder if that is something we saw, because I just remember there was a very brief moment very early on in the pandemic, in the UK anyway, when the top 10 gaming items, or maybe it was the top 20, I can't remember now, the Wii remote reappeared in it. Now obviously they're not new gamers, because I assume they have Nintendo Wiis, but it said to me that this is an audience of people. They're an audience of people that haven't played a game in 10 years, who are now dusting off their consoles in the cupboards. And I guess that was my single anecdotal point of proof that we were finding new customers. But
they're not new, because they had a Wii in the cabinet.
Yeah.
They're
returning, maybe.
They're lapsed gamers.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And at the beginning of the pandemic, everyone tried anything to take their mind off of the horror that was erupting around them. And I think the bloom went off that rose pretty fast for that category. So if we're not bringing new people in with our offering of the console and the game, how do we think we're going to get new people by just making the same game? I mean, there's a vast majority of the planet which have already said, Grand Theft Auto, not that interesting. Call of Duty, not that interesting. They were both huge hits in our little village of gamers. The biggest things in the world. I mean, Grand Theft Auto 5, I think every gamer has bought 2 copies of it. That's the only way the sales numbers make any sense. But you're not. If people have already said they're not interested in that experience, building more of those experiences will not get them in. It seems pretty axiomatic to me.
And when you look at sort of the movie industry, look at what works in certain territories. They have their own movie industries, right, with their own Bollywood or Nollywood, or whatever's the terms that people use to describe these sort of movie industries in other territories, which, because they acknowledge that those countries and those markets and those people might actually want something that's different to the rest of the world. And it's an interesting thing. I hear execs all the time talk about that, but I don't actually see that manifest itself outside of the indie space anyway, in games that are actually trying to talk to those sectors. I've sort of already gone off topic in the opening bit.
No, it's all of the same thing, right? It's how does an entertainment industry continue to grow and expand and reach new people? And to my mind, that's through innovation, to bring out new kinds of games. Okay, you don't like first-person shooters and you don't like RPGs. Here's something else. Here's a rhythm action gaming piece that's all about music and bright colors and having a good time. Where's the space for those games, and how do we continue to provide outreach to get new people involved in the interactive entertainment world?
Well, obviously, one way to solve it's a short-term solution to this is to try and get your costs down while you're trying to seek out that growth, I guess. Are you getting a sense that the games industry is trying to do that, or you're seeing that, at least in your travels around speaking to studios?
Sure, everybody has cost control in their mind. I mean, you're sort of born with that. But it's getting harder to do. I think the rising in wages is a good thing. I think people need to be paid a fair wage for their work, and if you're working on projects which stand to make tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars, I think the reward you receive from that activity should be commensurate with your contribution. So rising wages is not a problem. I do think that we have to re-examine what the scope of games are, and how big is big, or how big is enough. If we still live in a world where you can look at different surveys and stuff where the average game, only 32% of gamers actually finish the game. So we're making a lot of game that no one's seeing, or 68% of the people aren't seeing it. Let's look at that question. And should we continue to build games that are unlikely for most of the people to even see the end of it? Because it costs to build to the end. And, you can tighten that up. And if you can make your games on a shorter timeline, that will reduce your cost because it's just labor against time. It'll get you to market faster. You can please your customers sooner than always telling them to wait 4 to 5 years for your next opus. Yeah, I think we just have to re-examine how we present ourselves and our games to the gaming public. And if people are going to say, "Well, it's not 120 hours. I don't want to buy that," well, then you have to refactor your expectations of what a game should be. Does it really have to be 120 hours?
Yeah. Well, I spent pretty much 9 months trying to finish the new Zelda game. I didn't want to spend 9 months, to be honest with you, on a game that size. But I'm not entirely sure I'm the typical gamer. So is it length? Is that the thing? Is it sort of controlling the size of your game, or is there more to it?
It's a combination of things. I mean, length is just one measure I talk about, just because it was such a big deal in the early days of gaming, right? In the PlayStation 1, 2, 3 generations, that was like your top review point was, oh, such and such game came out. It's got 90 hours of gameplay. It's amazing. We kept judging games by how much gameplay you get for your dollar. And maybe that was a decent metric back in the times when the average gamer was late teens, early 20s, which means you're time rich and money poor. So having to sit down for that long of a sesh to get through, some huge RPG didn't seem like a reasonable thing to do when you're 19 years old. I just think now the average age of gamers is approaching early 30s. You got the flip, right? You're more money rich and more time poor. Yeah. And you have to really kind of strap on some free time if you're going to sit down with Red Dead Redemption 2 and open that up and try to get through that whole thing. So we need to understand where our customers are. What are they looking for? If they want a high impact, high enjoyment piece of gaming, which may not include large sections of the game where you're going on a quest to find this blue rock to bring it to the red troll and he'll open a door for you, which is just kind of like burning time cycles. It's called grinding for a reason, and maybe that's not the enjoyable gameplay mechanic that we used to put up with or used to enjoy 25 years ago. And maybe we want tighter gameplay with more action, more impact, more exciting things going on over maybe a shorter time frame.
We've seen it in TV though. Back in the day, all TV shows were like 20 odd episodes long because it was and it needed to last the season. And now in the wake of streaming, it's as long as the story needs it to be, isn't it? It's it can be 8 episodes, 5 episodes, 13 episodes. It can be even more. Right? It's.
I love Battlestar Galactica as much as anybody who was into that into that genre, but after a 23 episode season, there are a handful of episodes there which you could really skip. That really didn't move the narrative along.
Yeah. And yeah, so yeah, I go say because what about the technical enhancement? Because obviously we're looking in this new generation. We've moved into ray tracing, and everything needs to be 60 frames per second, and all that kind of stuff. Is that stuff that, or do you think that gamers are not as tolerant of if the quality isn't quite, the visual quality rather isn't quite there?
You know, I think we've made a lot about visual quality of games, the graphic quality, the resolution, the enhancement, the near photorealism that so many games seem to chase. And our fans thought that was a noble journey, and you know we saw the difference between graphics in PlayStation 1, where Lara Croft is 800 polygons, and you kind of squint and it looks like a person, and now we get to highly realized modeling around that. But did it improve the gameplay? Did it improve the story? Visually arresting, but if the game itself doesn't provide the excitement and the mechanics and a narrative or a story that you're interested around, the graphics can't save you. And maybe we've put too much emphasis in that. I think as more we try to chase the uncanny valley, we realize it's not. I don't believe it's transversal as possible. I don't think you can get across the uncanny valley. I think that will always be just 5 steps ahead of you every step you go, and you won't get there. So instead of chasing that, let's go back to exciting game design. I love a good anime. I love highly realized animated characters are exciting because they can tell a different kind of story and give a different sort of flavor to the atmosphere that you're in. So those things I think are promising to go for. And when we talk about ray tracing and some of that, the console war began as a missile race, right? Whether it was Sega, Nintendo, then it was Sega, PlayStation, then it was Xbox and PlayStation, and each side is trying to push the edge of tech. To people talked about teraflops all the time without really understanding what it meant, but somehow more were better than less, and so that was a factor. And you had all these different kind of metrics that people were throwing around to measure their game. But we've gotten to the point now where, with advanced ray tracing and other ways of realizing, and most of the platforms can do 60 frames per second. Some can do 120 frames per second, which your eye can't register anyway. But I think we're at the edge of the universe of that now. We're in the realm of differences that only dogs can hear. and maybe that's not where the emphasis should be now on pushing the edge of the tech envelope. We're all going to need neural implants to really appreciate all the differences that we're putting into games right now. But let's go back to the original story. What can I do that would be amusing, entertaining, interactive, that someone would want to spend some money and spend some time, learn this story, go through this adventure, and enjoy themselves, and at a way that they feel that they're getting value for money, and that we can continue to pay, at least living wages or better to the people who make them.
So I've got this because obviously, the thing is when you work in the games media, you do see the sort of more extreme corners of games communities who lose their mind because a screenshot suggests the puddle isn't quite realistic enough, or
you can't bet the dog.
Yeah. How dare there's the Paper Mario game that's just coming out by Nintendo, and apparently it runs at 30 frames per second, even though nobody. It's honestly like the worst thing that's ever happened. Even though I'm pretty sure no one's going to notice who actually plays that game. So is it realistic to sort of then go to games? And you know what, gamers, we're going to now put out shorter games, and we're not going to invest too much in new tech features and actually get away with it.
Well, you don't say the quiet part out loud. Again, let's stop looking at the game as it's merely a collection of time-based activities with a certain visual acuity to it, and has a character that you like. Let's go back and just look at games. What would be a fun thing to do? Let's create an activity that would be fun, and that you'd want to play it, I'd want to play it, and this is how the rules look like, this is what the characters will be like, and not begin to deconstruct a game simply based on, okay, what's its frame rate? Did it hold 60 every time? Did it ever drop below 40 frames per second? And is it all running at 4K, or do they have to go down to 1080p or something? You don't deconstruct movies that way.
No.
And games they're based on tech, but they're built with entertainment in mind. And Is it going to be entertaining or not?
It's interesting. I get a lot as well when it comes to the price of games, and they've got people saying, if the game isn't running at X amount or is only 20 hours long, I shouldn't be paying this amount of money. And I'm like, but my argument for that was always been, I don't go to the cinema and go and see, I don't know, the latest indie movie and then come out and go, no, it didn't look as good as Avengers, I need my money back. That's not how I judge the value of entertainment. But it's I guess value is a subjective thing. I'm not entirely sure. That wasn't really a question.
But I think your movie reference is appropriate, because I mean, I'm at the point now where I go to, I look at, when I go to see a movie, I do now check runtime. And if it says runtime 2 hours and 57 minutes, I go, geez, I don't have that kind of time. I can't do that.
I don't have that kind of bladder.
Give me a good 95-minute movie that sticks the landing. I'll take that every time.
Yeah. What about
and talk about Marvel? I mean, there's another thing where that blockbuster train, began growing in the late 2008, 2009, mm-hmm. and then just blew through the 2010s right after the pandemic, and then all of a sudden, no one wants the MCU anymore.
Yeah.
So people can get all excited about a thing and then go off it really fast.
What about so one of the things we're going to be talking about on GeoSprint, we can talk about a lot about sort of how teams operate and mm-hmm. processes and getting things right in the concept stage. There'll be a lot of that, but we're also going to talk about the technical stuff. And one of the things that we're getting asked about is AI. And what I've seen of AI hasn't overly convinced me it's going to make a massive impact on the speed at which games are being made. Not yet, anyway. But do you think that's a potential avenue to reduce costs? Is that something that you're optimistic about?
Well, I think we've talked a lot about, the way we make games has essentially remained unchanged in 40 years. Mm-hmm. And typically when the game gets more complex or there's more heavy lifting yet to be done or we need more art assets, which is always happening, typically we've just thrown people at it. Mm-hmm. We throw people at it, or we hire some people in Malaysia and throw them at it, or we hire some people in Eastern Europe and throw them at it. Labor has always been the default response for increased workload and scope of game. And I like to think that people in the interactive entertainment business, certainly in the coding and programming side, are some of the smartest minds out there in computer science. We need to make the machine do more of the work. We need to get more heavy lifting out of the technology, build the tool sets, build the engines that can help this room. I look at what happened with the guys at Hello Games with No Man's Sky. Mm-hmm. A game with ultimately infinite scope, but is essentially done by less than 10 people. Because they spent a lot of time building the pipeline, a lot of time building the tool set. Then they could just create over time by a small team, making the machine do most of the procedural heavy lifting. We need to get more of that into gaming. Is AI the answer? No, AI is an answer. AI will be an assisting technology. Of course, you've got people like McKinsey or other public, I think it was McKinsey, so I don't want to slander anybody. Some large business consulting group has made the claim that by 2030, 50% of games will all be written by AI. That is not going to happen. AI only sees in one direction, which is backwards. It sees backwards, it puts stuff together to make you think you're seeing forward, but you're really not. You're seeing a rehash of backward. So where I see that AI plays can play a very functional role is AI is kind of like the intern, right? The really eager intern you have that's you say, hey, give me 9 pages on something. They'll go, sure, boss. And I crank it out. But you do have to fact check it. You have to go through and read it and go, well, actually, that's not true, because AI hallucinates and AI kind of goes off the rails. But as far as creating first drafts of things, or as far as summarizing, it's a great summarizing tool to take a bunch of knowledge into a space and summarize this in 4 paragraphs. It's really good at that. So I think we will see it doing more first draft work. Some of the video AI kits that are out there, you can mock up a scene pretty fast to get an idea of, does this look like an interesting thing with, let's have all these cars coming off the top of the Louvre into the square in Paris. What would that look like? And you can kind of mock that up and get an idea. So I think in that ideation phase, it can help speed things up. But I don't see it writing games anytime soon.
When I used to work in print, so when I used to do games magazines, I'd often try very hard to try and explain to my designer what I had in mind for the cover image. And I actually sit and think, if I had AI access today, if I had that back then, it would look rubbish, and he would design something far better and far more interesting. But it would be a lot better for me to be able to go, rather than try and explain to him or draw a really crude, I'm terrible at drawing, image on a piece of paper of what I want, to actually, I could see how that would work. But it would be it'd almost be a behind the scenes process to deliver something original rather than rather than using it for the actual product at the end. How do you we started off talking about the state of the, I am distracted by your cat, it looks cute as anything. Always trying
to get on camera. Yeah.
How do you you talked earlier about the state of the games industry currently and what's going on in it. How do you see the current situation coming to an end in terms of the challenges that we're facing?
There are a number of different possible endings, and some of them are quite horrible. But I think there's hope as well, because you have to have hope. We went through this time of artificial growth during the pandemic, and I would have expected more companies to recognize that this is a very limited time party, people. Make hay while the sun shines, but don't make huge investments against what you think is a never-ending 20% growth rate year on year, because that's not continuing.
Yeah.
But get excited in the moment. You don't want to miss the opportunity, and so you bulk up. And none of us knew how long the pandemic was going to last or lockdown was going to last. So I guess you do make investments to try to jump on the potential that may be longer than it turned out to be. But that's a huge gamble. You're betting on the come, and if it doesn't happen, then you're stuck out of position with a huge labor load. And I think a lot of companies found them that way. Large Scandinavian concerns, which were never a big player in the gaming industry, became one of the top 4 players in the gaming industry almost overnight. And apparently their reach has exceeded their grasp, and so now they're restructuring their empire of studios. But even big players like my old shop or my old competition over at Xbox, they're finding that, as I think we also said in a talk a couple of years ago, that acquisition's the easy part, integration's the hard part. Mm-hmm. It's easy to buy a thing, it's hard to run a thing. Yeah. And I think a lot of companies are, if not having necessarily buyer's remorse, are certainly finding it harder to digest what they've consumed. And sadly, it's leading to some of this labor layoff problem we've seen that began in 23, which hasn't really abated in 24.
Yeah, there's a thing, again, not just about Microsoft, other companies do it as well. A lot of people adopt this limited integration approach now, where they buy a studio and they leave you to do your thing and explore. Some of the companies that you mentioned there do that. But actually, there is an element of me that I look at the games they were making and they've decided to make as a team, and I think there does need to be a bit slightly stronger hand here on what. Maybe that's the wrong thing to say. Maybe they should be allowed to be creative and try the new things and stuff. But I look at what those companies may have needed to grow and what they were putting out, and it wasn't necessarily. There seemed to be a clash between letting the developers do what they want to do, and also whilst needing the stuff to deliver the growth you might have for your subscription service or your console or your publishing business or whatever. I don't know if I agree even with myself with that, saying that out loud. But sometimes I look at the output of some of these companies, and you saw it with your old shop and Sony. Some of the stuff they've closed are studios that are working on projects that they commissioned a couple of years ago when the industry looked different, and they thought, oh, these games are working. These games are what's going to drive for us. And then very quickly now they come out. I find it. I'm sort of jumping around a little bit, but what you were saying earlier about games companies making decisions based on what they saw during the pandemic baffle me. Right? It just not just any companies. I'm just about to not work for them. We're about to be bought by a different company. But I work for Reed Pop, and during the pandemic, of course, they were an events business. They decided that events, and they were fearful the events would never come back. So they started to pivot and invest, and they cut staff from certain areas and invested in other areas with the idea of where they thought things were going to go post-pandemic. And here's the thing: what happened? Less so in games, but very much in the Comic-Con industry. The events came back stronger than them before. So what they've now had to do is they've now had to pivot back to the. But I'm like, why did you make the assumption in the first place that that this was going to be that the world was going to be so radically. You know, the world has changed coming out of the pandemic, but changed to the point. But how did you know? We didn't know what was going to happen. And making decisions based on that, there was nothing to base these decisions on. It was sorry, I'm ranting a little bit. I'm going all over the place.
No, it's okay. I've got my cat's tail in my mouth. But it's human nature, right? You know, if you're at the craps table and someone's got the hot hand and they're running the table, you just want to jump on that train and get a piece of that before it goes.
Yeah.
That's why patience is the thing that's important. And the industry is losing patience. You know, we need to find a way to solve this problem in 6 months. In an industry where nothing gets done in 6 months, right? You talked about people buying studios and talking about creative autonomy, and we love the creatives, and we're going to let them, do their thing and build the great games they're here to make, and we're not here to tell them what to do. Sorry, sweetie.
I love it.
Sweetie, Daddy's on TV. Okay. We talk about studio autonomy, creative autonomy, and we give them all that sort of thing, and that's great. That's good. And we're not going to tell you how to build your game because you're the expert on that. We just want to help you realize your goal. Fine and good. But the minute the money thing gets a bit tight across the whole enterprise, all of a sudden the companies come back to all the studios and say, we're in a tough spot. We're gonna miss our profitability targets. Everybody's got to take a haircut. And some of the smaller studios are going, why do I need the haircut? I mean, you bought me for a little bit of money over here to give me some freedom to do the thing I do. I didn't tell you to spend double-digit billions of dollars on buying other stuff. That all of a sudden will be the sacrificial lamb because you've got to make that balance sheet work on your other purchases. So it's not a true offer, right? When they say we're going to buy you and give you all of your autonomy, unless of course our other financial exigencies force us to close you.
Yeah.
Things are completely out of the control of the small studio.
Yeah. And it's sometimes I do feel a bit, for certain companies, I feel, because when your competitors are increasing salaries and hiring up and investing in their IP, it takes a brave company to go, yeah, we're not going to do that, right? Because you want to keep up, right? So I know this is a lot of people say the games industry spent too much money. So I think some companies didn't necessarily want to.
Nintendo did okay.
Yeah, but there's a great example of Nintendo. I don't know how true this is. It's a story I was told by someone who was associated with it. But Nintendo bought Next Level Games during that period of sort of acquisition. It's basically all they bought. But they didn't really want to. Next Level Games wanted to jump on the fact that loads of studios were being bought up, their valuations were going up, there was benefits. The founders of that company decided to sell. And Nintendo had a choice. They could let the company be sold to someone else that didn't know, or they could buy them. And ultimately, they make their Luigi's Mansion game. It's a big hit game for them. Nintendo, in a way, I don't know if that's true, but I imagine there was an element of the fact that they felt they had to do something that maybe they was not really. They don't buy many companies, Nintendo. But you're right. Nintendo is the wonderful. A lot of Japanese companies actually were just very. They increased salaries and stuff, but they were quite conservative outside of that.
Right. But the next level story, spoke to even Nintendo gets FOMO. Right. And FOMO is what drives the whole thing. You see Google hiring 10,000 metaverse employees, and then you're Facebook, and you got to buy yourself some metaverse employees because you don't want Google to have all the metaverse guys. And it just swings around. Then now you get rid of the metaverse team and you put in the AI team, and everyone's throwing a bunch of money around to build these things because they don't want to miss the AI train, whatever that means.
Yeah, well, yeah, whatever the next one is. We've gone through a bunch of those now, haven't we? So what advice would you give to studios right now that are trying to make their budget stretch a little longer, make their runway a bit better? What advice would you give to them?
Be disciplined and murder your darlings. Oh. That's one thing we see in studios where they will hold on to a thought or an idea or a wish, and you have to constantly interrogate what it is you think you're doing. And speed up proof of concept, speed up proof of tech, so you can make the hard call and say that's not working. The people who continue to try to make the thing work over an extended period of time, thinking if we just do a little bit more, we can get there. But the rest of your game is sometimes just waiting for that mechanic to be established. and it's going to slow you down. You've got to have a really good idea, a disciplined idea of what it is you want to make, how you're going to make it. Hold your deadlines tight. Don't be slippy on your alpha target or your beta target. Look to teams that do it right. Any team that builds an annual sports game, that's a wonder to behold. They do a new game in 9 months every year. Because like at my old shop where they did MLB The Show in San Diego, Major League Baseball is not changing opening day. It's April 1st every freaking year.
Yeah.
But you can say, well, they know what they're doing. It's the same 32 teams. It's the same, stadia. It's the same players, so they have to move them around. Yeah, because they've identified what their variables are year to year. Then they have a list of, here are things we can add. We take care of all the maintenance of moving the players around, updating stadia, get new face scans. And here's some new things we can add over time. But then you have a date when you go, that's it, feature lock, boom, we're done.
Yeah.
Too much of game development. And I'm sure by saying this, I'll get a bunch of game developers to go, Layden, you're so old school. You don't know that we've made so many changes. We're so much better than we used to be. Watch Mythic Quest on Apple Plus.
I watched that.
Someone told me to watch that. He said, it's a great comedy. I said, what do you mean comedy? It's a documentary. Because there is a lot of, but that's the creative process, right? You want to be able to have people be inspired and come up with new ideas and really have a flash moment where I've solved the problems of the universe and let me tell you how I did it. But you've got to have a strong hand in management, production management, or as we call it, artist management, to keep people with their eye on the ball. So that's great. That's great. We've missed the window of putting that feature in. Oh, but it'd be so good if we did. It'll break all these other things if we do.
Yeah.
So hold on to that. We'll come back to it, but stay on path, stay on course.
My original magazine, so my original job, I worked on a MCV magazine, and it was a weekly. And most people in my field at the time worked on monthly magazines, and they could never understand how. And my team was no bigger than a monthly mags team, and they could never understand how we would do. And it's like, how do you put that out? And sometimes the magazines were 100 pages, like as big as a monthly, depending on how successful. Particularly at Christmas. Right. And by the way, I have the same concern about people who do daily papers. Like, I don't know how they do that. But the thing is, that we had a process, right? We had a system. Like, we each day had its thing, and once we got to that point, right, that's that section of the magazine done. It's got to be done. It's got to be out. And the magazine had to come out every Thursday. We couldn't, if we slipped, it was now at the weekend, and we'd missed all it was this industry paper, right? Nobody worked there, so it's we never slipped. I worked on it for 9 years. I did 450 magazines, and we were never late. And some that included when there was a bank holiday. We had to do it in 4 days in those situations. But it was because we were just drilled. There was room for innovation, and there was room to be creative, but there was also times when you stopped doing that and you had to put it out. And if you had an idea that didn't make it, you had a feature concept. We had a visual idea we couldn't quite pull off. It's all right. There's another issue. There's another one in a few days. And it just went in that instead, and that's how it worked. And it wasn't. I don't want to call it like it wasn't a sort of conveyor belt of assembly line, but there was an element of, there were certain things we didn't need to change, and we could repeat and copy paste. But yeah, I think it's just basically backing up what you're saying there from my own peer experience.
Develop a process and stick to it and be disciplined about it. And if you can turn games around in 2 to 3 years rather than 5 to 6 years, it's easier to set aside an idea now, because you go, I'll get back to it in 2 years.
Yeah.
Than in the current model, where if I don't get this idea now, there may not be a sequel. There may never be a chance for this thing to ever be seen 6 years from now. So
yeah, and it must be quite. I always think whenever my brother, he works at Playground Games, working on the Fable game. He's 30 years old almost, and he was telling me the day that he thinks he's got 4 or 5 games left in him, and that for me was like, oh goodness, imagine thinking like that. it's how long these projects take to make. So I've taken way too much of your time, Shawn.
It's always good to hang with you, Chris.
It's amazing stuff. And so I'm gonna call it there. That is all we have time for. Thank you so much for your time and insight.
Keep the schedule, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. It's yes, exactly. Let's keep to the message. It's always incredibly valuable hearing what you've got to say and what you've got to learn. For those listening or watching, there will be more to come from GI Sprint and all sorts of topics like AI and cloud and team synergy and failing fast and getting hybrid working to work and distributed teams and all sorts of stuff that's going on over the course of the month. The easiest way to make sure you don't miss any of it would be to sign up to the GamesIndustry.biz newsletter. It's completely free. It's at GamesIndustry.biz/newsletters. But until the next one, thank you all for tuning in.